The Galactic Concord had ruled the stars for more than 2 million years, and in all that time, nothing had truly changed. 17 species made up the great alliance that governed known space. And each of them had conquered the one enemy that once haunted all living things: death itself. The Valkyrie were beings of living crystal, who could rebuild their bodies from a single shard. Their consciousness stored in quantum patterns that could never be destroyed. The Omnith floated through the clouds of gas giants as vast thinking clouds, splitting and merging across centuries without ever truly ending. The Scythian existed as a hive mind of billions of interconnected creatures, each one carrying the memories of all the others, so that no single death meant anything, and all these and 14 other species had formed the Concord in the ancient past, back when they still remembered what it meant to fear the end. But that was so long ago that none of them could truly recall the feeling anymore. Death had become a myth, a story told to young ones to explain why the primitive creatures on backwater worlds behaved so strangely. The immortals had built their civilization on the assumption that everything would last forever, because they would last forever. Their wars were not really wars at all, but elaborate games played across centuries, with rules and negotiations and outcomes that everyone agreed upon in advance. Why would anyone fight to destroy when nothing could truly be destroyed? And no one would actually lose anything that mattered. Their art had become repetitive because artists had endless time to create and no urgency to innovate. Their science had slowed to a crawl because scientists could spend 10,000 years on a single experiment and still have eternity stretching out before them. The Concord was stable, peaceful, and utterly stagnant, though none of its members realized this because they had nothing to compare their existence to. Ambassador Velkith had served the Concord for nearly 40,000 years, which made her young by the standards of her crystalline people. She had witnessed the rise and fall of artificial stars, the construction of megastructures that spanned entire solar systems, and diplomatic negotiations that lasted longer than some species existed on primitive worlds. Nothing surprised her anymore because she had seen everything the galaxy had to offer. Or so she believed when the long-range sensors detected a new species developing faster than light travel in an unremarkable spiral arm of an unremarkable galaxy. Velkith volunteered for the first contact mission without much enthusiasm. She had performed this duty before with dozens of other species, guiding them slowly into the Concord over thousands of years, teaching them the ways of immortality, watching them shed their primitive fears of death. The process was always the same, always predictable, always boring. Her crystalline ship dropped out of hyperspace near the third planet of a yellow star, a world the natives called Earth. Velkith began her standard scans, expecting to find another young species just beginning to reach for the stars, full of hope and fear and all the emotions that immortals had long since forgotten. What she found instead made her ancient mind freeze with something she had not felt in 30,000 years. The creatures below lived for less than 100 of their planet's orbital cycles. They knew from the moment of their birth that they would die, that their bodies would fail, that their minds would cease to exist. And yet they had built cities and nations and cultures and technologies that reached toward the stars anyway. Velkith ran her scans again and again, certain that she had made an error, but the results remained the same. These humans, as they called themselves, were fully aware of their own mortality, and they had not collapsed into despair or paralysis or madness. They had built a civilization. The ambassador watched their world for 7 rotations, studying their broadcasts and their networks and their history. And with each passing moment, her confusion grew into something darker. The humans did not merely accept their deaths as inevitable. They seemed to draw strength from the knowledge. They created art that burned with urgency because the artists knew they had limited time to express themselves. They pursued scientific discoveries with reckless speed because the scientists knew they could not wait for the answers to come slowly. They loved each other with fierce intensity because they knew their time together was brief. Valkith observed a human funeral, watching as the creatures gathered to mourn one of their dead, and she felt something stir in the quantum patterns of her consciousness that she could not identify. The mourners wept and spoke of the dead one's life, of the things they had done and the people they had touched. And then they returned to their own lives with a determination that seemed almost aggressive. They did not stop or slow down or give up. Because one of them had ended, they simply kept going. Faster, if anything, as if the death had reminded them that their own time was running out. The ambassador composed a report to the High Assembly with great care, choosing each word precisely because she knew that what she had discovered would shake the foundations of everything the Concord believed. I have made contact with a species unlike any we have encountered before, she wrote. They are mortal in the truest sense of the word, aware of their deaths from the beginning of their lives. And yet they have not been destroyed by this knowledge. Instead, they have been transformed by it into something I do not fully understand. I recommend extreme caution in our dealings with these humans. They possess something we lost so long ago that we have forgotten it ever existed. They possess urgency. Valkith transmitted her report and waited for the response from the Concord, not knowing that she had just announced the arrival of the most dangerous species the Immortals had ever encountered. Not dangerous because of their weapons or their numbers or their technology, all of which were primitive compared to the Concord. Dangerous because they remembered something the Immortals had forgotten. Dangerous because they knew how to live while dying. And most dangerous of all, because they would soon teach the galaxy that immortality was not a gift but a cage, and that the key to escape had been death all along. The High Assembly of the Galactic Concord gathered in the Great Chamber at the center of their artificial world, a sphere of living metal that had existed for nearly 1,000,000 years. Representatives from all 17 elder species took their places in the vast circular hall, their forms ranging from the crystalline towers of the Velkari to the floating gas clouds of the Omnith, to the writhing mass of the Scythian collective. They had not assembled for a matter of genuine importance in nearly 10,000 years, because nothing important ever happened anymore. But Ambassador Velketh's report had changed that. You claim these creatures are aware of their own mortality. The Supreme Elder of the Omnith rumbled, his voice echoing through the chamber like distant thunder. And yet they continue to function as a society. That is correct. Velketh replied from her place at the center of the chamber. This seems impossible. The Scythian collective buzzed through 1,000 voices speaking as one. We removed the burden of death from ourselves, precisely because awareness of mortality leads to despair and collapse. Our ancestors believed the same thing, Velketh said carefully. But we have no records of what life was like before we achieved immortality, because that was so very long ago. Perhaps these humans are simply not intelligent enough to understand their own condition, suggested the elder of the crystalline Morith. Lesser creatures do not fear death because they cannot comprehend it. I observed them for 7 rotations. The ambassador responded. They understand death completely, and they think about it constantly. And they create entire philosophies and religions and art forms around the concept. The chamber fell silent, which was unusual because the Immortals love to debate and argue and discuss for centuries without reaching any conclusion. Finally, the Supreme Elder of the Velkari, an ancient being named Sitharan who had lived for nearly 300,000 years, spoke in a voice like grinding stones. We must study these humans more closely before we decide how to proceed with first contact. And so a delegation was sent to the small blue world called Earth. A team of scientists and diplomats and philosophers from a dozen different species, all of them immortal, all of them unable to truly imagine what it meant to die. They walked among the humans in disguised forms, watching and listening and trying to understand how a species could function while carrying the weight of inevitable death. What they found disturbed them more deeply than any of them had expected. The humans did not merely accept death. They seemed to actively defy it with every moment of their brief lives. A human artist would work frantically on a painting or a sculpture or a piece of music, driven by the knowledge that they might not live long enough to complete their next work. A human scientist would pursue discoveries with reckless speed, unwilling to wait for slow, careful progress because they knew their time was limited. A human parent would love their children with fierce, desperate intensity because they knew they would not be there forever to protect them. The delegation observed a human named Marcus Chun who was dying of a disease that his primitive medicine could not cure. He had perhaps 6 months left to live, and he knew this with certainty. And yet he did not retreat into despair or spend his remaining time in idle pleasure. Instead, he worked harder than ever before on a project to build schools in impoverished regions of his world, racing against his own death to leave something meaningful behind. One of the Valkyrie scientists approached Marcus in disguise and asked him why he bothered to work so hard when he would not live to see the results. Marcus smiled, and his eyes held a light that the immortal had never seen before. "Because it matters," Marcus said simply. "My life is short, which means every moment of it is precious, and I refuse to waste a single one." "But you will die," the scientist pressed. "Nothing you do will change that. Everything I do changes that," Marcus replied. "I will die, yes, but the schools will remain, and the children who learn in them will grow up and do things I cannot imagine. And in that way, some part of me will continue even after I am gone." The scientist returned to the delegation and reported this conversation, and the other immortals struggled to process what they had heard. They had built monuments that lasted millions of years, created technologies that would endure until the heat death of the universe, established empires that spanned galaxies, and yet none of their works had ever felt as urgent or as meaningful as this dying human's desperate race to build schools. The delegation requested that a human be allowed to address the High Assembly directly, and after much debate, the request was granted. Dr. Elena Vasquez was a philosopher who had spent her life studying the meaning of mortality, and she agreed to make the journey to the Concorde's great chamber. She was old by human standards, her hair white and her face lined with years, and she walked slowly as she took her place at the center of the vast assembly. The immortals looked down at this fragile creature who would be dead within a decade or two, and they felt something they could not name stirring in their ancient minds. "You have asked me to explain how my people live with the knowledge of death," Elena began, her voice strong despite her aged body. "But I think you are asking the wrong question. The right question is how you live without it." A murmur ran through the assembled immortals. Confusion and perhaps the first stirrings of something like fear. "You have forever," Elena continued, "and you have built wonders beyond imagination. But I have watched your people, and I have seen something missing in your eyes. You do not burn. You do not yearn. You do not love with the desperate fire of creatures who know that every embrace might be their last. You ask why we build knowing we will not see our work completed," she said, her voice rising. "You ask why we love knowing we will lose, why we try knowing we will fail. The answer is simple: because we will die. Every moment matters because we have so few, and every choice weighs more because we cannot take it back. You have forever, but you have forgotten why forever matters." "We remember." Elena fell silent, and the great chamber remained quiet for a long moment. Then the Supreme Elder of the Omnith spoke, his vast form trembling with an emotion he had not felt in 50,000 years. "What is this feeling?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "This sensation that grips my consciousness when I look at you." Elena smiled, and her aged face was beautiful with understanding. "That is fear," she said gently. "You are afraid because I have reminded you of something you buried long ago. Something your ancestors knew, but you have forgotten. Immortality is not life. It is merely existence. And existence without end is existence without meaning." The assembly dissolved into chaos as the immortals tried to process what they had heard. And somewhere deep in the quantum patterns of the Valkyrie consciousness and the neural networks of the Scython hive and the vast thoughts of the Omnith clouds, ancient memories began to stir, memories of what it had meant to be mortal, memories of urgency and passion and love that burned like stars, memories that had been buried for so long that they had become myths, and for the first time in 50,000 years, the immortals of the Galactic Concord felt something they had thought impossible. They felt truly, deeply, terrifyingly alive. 20 years had passed since the humans first made contact with the Galactic Concord, and in that time the small mortal species had established a dozen colony worlds across their region of space. The immortals watched with a mixture of fascination and unease as humanity expanded faster than any species in Concord history, driven by their desperate need to accomplish things before their brief lives ended. Most of the elder races maintained a cautious distance from the humans, still processing the disturbing ideas that Dr. Elena Vasquez had planted in their ancient minds. But the Scython collective had never been patient, even by immortal standards, and they had grown tired of treating these primitive mortals as anything special. The Scython were a hive mind of billions of interconnected creatures, each one carrying the memories and experiences of all the others. And they had existed in this form for nearly 800,000 years. They had fought wars against dozens of species over the millennia, always emerging victorious because they could not truly be defeated, only temporarily inconvenienced when a Scython warrior died. Its memories simply flowed back into the collective, and a new warrior would be grown to replace it. Within days, death meant nothing to them because nothing was ever really lost. The collective decided that the humans needed to be reminded of their place in the galactic order. 3 human colony worlds were selected for occupation: New Geneva, Horizon's Edge, and a small mining settlement called Perseverance. The Scython fleet arrived without warning, overwhelming the minimal human defenses and landing ground forces on all 3 worlds within hours. The collective expected the humans to respond the way every other species responded to Scython aggression, with diplomatic protests, negotiations, and eventually a face-saving compromise that would take centuries to finalize. They were wrong. The human response came in 6 days, not 6 months or 6 years or 6 decades, but 6 days. The combined fleets of the United Human Alliance dropped out of hyperspace above New Geneva, with weapons already firing. And what followed would be remembered by the Concord for millennia as the moment everything changed. The human ships were smaller and less advanced than the Scython vessels, their weapons weaker, their shields thinner, their crews made of fragile mortal flesh instead of endlessly replaceable drones. But they attacked with a ferocity that the Scython had never encountered in 800,000 years of existence. A human destroyer named the Unconquered ran directly into a Scython carrier 3 times its size. Its crew knowing that the collision would kill them all, but also knowing that it would disable the enemy ship. The captain of the Unconquered transmitted a final message as her vessel accelerated toward impact. "Tell my daughter I love her, and tell these things that humans do not surrender. The carrier's weapons tore through the destroyer's hull, killing hundreds of crew members in seconds, but the ship kept coming, its engines burning at maximum power until the moment of impact. The explosion destroyed both vessels, and the Sithon Collective reeled in confusion as it tried to process what had just happened. This was not how wars were fought. This was not rational behavior. This was madness, but the madness was only beginning. On the surface of New Geneva, human ground forces engaged the Sithon occupation army in brutal close combat. The Immortals had expected the humans to retreat, to preserve their irreplaceable lives, to negotiate from positions of safety. Instead, the humans charged directly into Sithon defensive positions, using their own bodies as shields, sacrificing themselves to create openings for their comrades. A sergeant named James Okonkwo held a bridge against an entire Sithon battalion for 7 hours, allowing civilian evacuations to proceed behind him. He knew he would die. He had known it from the moment he took his position, but he also knew that every minute he held the bridge was another minute of life for the thousands of civilians fleeing across it. When the Sithon finally overwhelmed his position, they found him still firing his weapon, his body riddled with wounds that should have killed him hours earlier, his eyes blazing with a light that the hive mind could not understand. His last words were transmitted across all human channels. Humanity does not kneel. The Sithon Collective had never experienced anything like this. They could not comprehend enemies who accepted death, who used their own mortality as a weapon, who seemed to burn brighter the closer they came to their end. A Sithon warrior could be replaced in days, which meant that individual deaths were meaningless, but a human soldier could never be replaced, which meant that each human death was a permanent loss. And yet the humans kept coming, kept fighting, kept dying and killing and refusing to stop. The collective tried to calculate the human strategy and failed. There was no strategy. There was only will. Pure and absolute and utterly terrifying. The war lasted 8 months. 8 months of human fleets throwing themselves at Sithon positions with suicidal determination. 8 months of human soldiers holding ground that could not be held, dying in places that should have been abandoned. 8 months of the Sithon Collective slowly realizing that they were not fighting a species, but a force of nature. The breaking point came at the Battle of Perseverance. The smallest and least important of the 3 occupied worlds, the Sithon had fortified the settlement heavily, expecting a prolonged siege that would give them leverage in negotiations. Instead, the humans launched a direct assault with forces that were outnumbered 3-1. The assault should have failed. It should have been a massacre, but the human commander, a woman named Admiral Chen Wei, led the attack personally from the front lines. Her flagship took hit after hit, losing crew members by the dozen, its hull breaching in multiple places, its weapons failing one by one. And still she pushed forward, broadcasting encouragement to her fleet, refusing to withdraw, refusing to surrender, refusing to accept that defeat was possible. When her flagship finally went critical, Admiral Chen ordered her crew to the escape pods and remained at her post, steering the dying vessel directly into the Sithon command ship. The explosion lit up the sky of Perseverance and broke the spine of the Sithon defense. The remaining human forces swept through the shattered enemy lines, and within hours the occupation was over. The Sithon Collective surrendered unconditionally. 3 days later, it was the first unconditional surrender in Concord history, and it sent shockwaves through every immortal species in the galaxy. The elder races had always believed that their immortality made them invincible because they had nothing to lose that could not be recovered. But the humans had taught them a terrible truth. Immortality had made them cowards. When you cannot die, you cannot truly risk anything. When every loss is temporary, Nothing feels truly precious. The humans could die, would die, knew they would die, and that knowledge made them unstoppable. Because they understood something the immortals had forgotten. Life is not measured in years. Life is measured in what you are willing to sacrifice for what you love. And the humans loved their freedom, their families, their future more than they feared their deaths. The Concorde would never see the galaxy the same way again. The aftermath of the Scythian War changed everything. For the first time in 50,000 years, the immortal species of the Galactic Concorde were forced to examine their own existence. And many of them did not like what they found. The war had been broadcast across all Concorde channels, and every immortal being in the galaxy had watched in horrified fascination as humans threw away their irreplaceable lives for causes they believed in. The images haunted them. Admiral Chun Wei steering her dying ship into the enemy. Sergeant Okonkwo holding the bridge until his last breath. Thousands of human soldiers charging into certain death with fierce joy in their eyes. How could creatures who knew they would die fight so hard? How could beings with such limited time sacrifice any of it willingly? The question spread through the Concorde like a virus, infecting minds that had been comfortable and stagnant for millennia, and then something unprecedented began to happen. The immortals started choosing to die. It began with a Volcari artist named Scythanol who had lived for 90,000 years. She had created countless works of art over the centuries, sculptures of living crystal that could shift and change and grow. But she had grown increasingly dissatisfied with her creations. They were beautiful, technically perfect, admired throughout the Concorde, and completely meaningless after the Scythian War. Scythanol traveled to Earth and spent 10 years living among humans, watching them create art with desperate urgency, seeing how they poured their entire beings into works they might not live to complete. She returned to her homeworld and called a gathering of the Volcari High Council. "I have decided to terminate my existence," she announced to the shocked assembly. "But first, I will create one final masterpiece. This work will be different from everything I have made before, because I know I will never make another. For the first time in 90,000 years, my art will matter." The council tried to stop her, but Scythanol was resolute. She spent 5 years on her final creation, a sculpture that depicted the moment of human death, the transition from life to nothingness, rendered in crystalline perfection when it was complete. She stood before it and allowed her consciousness to fade, her quantum patterns dissolving into randomness. Her ancient mind finally finding the peace of ending, the sculpture became the most famous work of art in Concorde history. And visitors would travel from across the galaxy to stand before it and weep. They wept because for the first time they understood what the humans had tried to tell. Then they wept because they finally felt something real. Scythanol was not the last. In the decades following the war, a movement began to spread through the younger generations of the elder races, a philosophy that came to be called the mortal way. Its followers argued that immortality had robbed them of meaning, that endless existence had made everything trivial, that the Concorde had been slowly dying of spiritual starvation for 50,000 years without realizing it. The humans had shown them what they were missing. The humans had reminded them what it meant to truly live. Thousands of immortals began to voluntarily limit their lifespans, choosing to accept death after a set number of years, usually between 1,000 and 10,000. They called themselves the Awakened, and they spoke of their choice with the fervor of religious converts. "I will live for 5,000 more years," a young Omnith named Serath declared in a massive gathering. "And then I will allow my consciousness to disperse into the clouds of my homeworld. Every moment between now and then will be precious, because I know it is finite. I will love more deeply, create more boldly, live more fully than any immortal has lived in millennia. The Concord's leadership watched this development with growing alarm. The mortal way was spreading faster than any ideology in history, jumping from species to species, infecting minds that had been stable for hundreds of thousands of years. Emergency sessions of the High Assembly were called to address what many called the mortality crisis. This is a contagion, the Supreme Elder of the Scythian Collective declared, his hive mind still traumatized by the war that his people had lost. The humans have infected us with their death worship. We must quarantine them before this spreads further. Extermination would be more efficient, suggested an elder of the Morth. Remove the source of the infection and the disease will fade. But others in the assembly rose to challenge these proposals. We tried to fight the humans, Velkith reminded them, her voice heavy with the weight of all she had witnessed. The Scythian learned how that ends, and even if we could destroy them, would that undo what they have shown us? Would that erase the memory of Admiral Chun burning into the enemy like a dying star? Would that make us forget what we felt when we watched Sergeant Okonkwo hold that bridge? The assembly fell into bitter debate that lasted for years. But no consensus could be reached. Some species tried to isolate themselves from human influence, closing their borders and restricting contact. Others embraced the mortal way fully. Entire civilizations choosing to abandon immortality in favor of limited lifespans, and humanity simply continued to expand, to grow, to live and die and create and love. With the fierce urgency that had always defined them, they did not try to spread their philosophy deliberately. They did not send missionaries or propaganda or arguments. They simply existed, burning bright in a galaxy of eternal dimness. And their light attracted those who had lived too long in the dark. A generation of young immortals grew up watching human entertainment, reading human literature, studying human history. They saw how humans fell in love knowing they would lose each other, how humans built families knowing their children would one day bury them, how humans created masterpieces knowing they would not live to create many more. And these young immortals began to ask questions that their elders could not answer. Why do we exist if existence has no meaning? Why do we create if our creations do not matter? Why do we love if love has no urgency? The mortal way was not just a philosophy anymore. It was a revolution, spreading through the Concord like fire through dry grass, transforming everything it touched, and at the center of it all, unaware of the chaos they had caused, the humans simply continued to live their brief, brilliant lives. They did not understand why the immortals found them so fascinating. They did not realize that their mere existence was reshaping galactic civilization. They were just being human, doing what humans had always done, loving fiercely, creating desperately, living fully in the shadow of inevitable death. It was the most powerful thing in the universe, and the immortals were only beginning to understand why. 500 years had passed since a crystalline ambassador first looked upon a small blue world and felt the stirrings of ancient fear the galaxy had transformed beyond recognition. The Galactic Concord still existed in name, but it was no longer the stagnant empire of immortal beings who had forgotten how to live. Half of the 17 elder species had adopted what they called limited mortality, choosing lifespans measured in thousands of years rather than eternity. The Velkari now live for 10,000 years before allowing their crystalline bodies to shatter into dust. And in that time they created art that made the works of their immortal ancestors look like the scribblings of children. The Omnith had divided into two factions: the Eternal who clung to their ancient ways, and the Awakened who chose to disperse into the cosmic winds after 5,000 years of existence. Even the Scythian Collective, still bearing the psychological scars of their defeat, had begun experimenting with individual mortality, allowing certain members of the hive mind to truly end rather than simply flowing back into the whole, and humanity had become something that no one could have predicted 5 centuries earlier. They were not the most powerful species in the galaxy, nor the most numerous, nor the most technologically advanced, but they were the most influential, their ideas spreading to every corner of known space, their philosophy reshaping civilizations that had existed for millions of years. Human ambassadors were welcomed on every world, not because of human military strength, but because beings who had lived for centuries wanted to understand how creatures who lived for decades could burn so brightly. Human artists were celebrated throughout the Concord, their works prized above those of immortal masters, because they carried the weight of mortality in every brushstroke and every note. Human philosophers were invited to address assemblies of beings who had spent more time thinking than humanity had existed as a species. And these ancient minds listened with something approaching reverence. The great archives of the Concord had been reorganized to reflect a new understanding of history. The era before human contact was now called the long stagnation. 50,000 years when nothing truly new emerged, when no species dared to risk what they could not afford to lose, when immortality had become a prison disguised as a paradise. The era after human contact was called the Awakening, and historians were still trying to catalog all the changes it had brought. New religions had emerged that venerated death as a sacred gift, rather than an enemy to be conquered. New art forms had developed that could only be created by beings who knew their time was limited. New sciences had arisen as researchers raced to make discoveries within their newly finite lifespans, and everywhere, in every corner of the galaxy, the memory of what humans had done echoed through the consciousness of species that had thought themselves beyond surprise. James Okafor had served as humanity's ambassador to the Galactic Concord for 30 years, and now he stood before the High Assembly for what he knew would be the last time. He was old, his hair white, his body frail, his hands trembling with the weight of his years, but his eyes were clear and bright, burning with the same fire that had terrified the immortals 5 centuries earlier. You have asked me why humanity has refused the gift of immortality, he said, his voice steady despite his age. You have offered us your technologies, your methods, your secrets of eternal life, and we have declined again and again, and you still do not understand why. The assembly was silent. Thousands of beings from dozens of species waiting to hear what the dying human would say. Let me tell you a story, James continued. When I was young, my grandmother was dying, and I asked her if she was afraid. She smiled at me and said that she was not afraid of death. She said that death was what made her life precious. She said that every moment she had spent with my grandfather, every meal they had shared, every sunset they had watched together, was beautiful precisely because they knew it would not last forever. She said that loving someone you will lose is the bravest thing any creature can do. She said that she would rather have 50 years of real life than 50,000 years of mere existence. James paused, and the assembly remained frozen, hanging on his every word. You had forever, he said softly, and you wasted it because forever meant nothing. You built monuments that lasted millions of years, and none of them mattered because you had infinite time to build more. You created art that could endure until the heat death of the universe, and it was empty because you felt no urgency in its creation. You loved each other in your fashion, but your love was pale and thin because you never faced the terror of losing what you cherished. We have moments, he continued, his voice rising, brief flickering moments between birth and death, and every single one of those moments is a universe unto itself. We love knowing we will lose, And our love is fierce beyond your comprehension. We create knowing we may not finish, and our creations burn with desperate beauty. We live knowing we will die, and our lives are worth more than all your endless eternities combined. James smiled, and his aged face held a peace that the immortals had sought for millennia without finding. "You ask me why we refuse immortality," he said. "But you already know the answer. You know it because for 500 years you have been learning to die. And in learning to die, you have finally learned to live. The mortality you once fled from in terror is the greatest gift existence has to offer. It is what makes everything matter. It is what makes love real and art beautiful and life worth living. You spend 50,000 years running from death. We spend our lives running toward it, trying to accomplish as much as we can before our time runs out. And that is why you will remember us long after the last human has turned to dust. Not because we were powerful, not because we were wise, not because we conquered the galaxy or built monuments that lasted forever, but because we reminded you what you had forgotten. Because we taught you the truth that your ancestors knew, and you buried so deep that it became myth. Life is not measured by its length. Life is measured by its depth, its passion, its love, its meaning, and meaning comes only from ending." James Okafor died 3 months later. Surrounded by his family on the world of his birth, the Galactic Concord declared a day of remembrance in his honor. The first time such an honor had been given to any being, mortal or immortal, and in the Great Hall of Remembrance at the heart of the Concord's capital, they inscribed his final words above the entrance where all could see them. "The universe will remember us not by how long we lasted, but by what we did with the time we had." It was a human proverb, simple and direct, and it contained more wisdom than all the philosophies the immortals had developed in 2 million years of existence. The elder races still spoke of humans with a mixture of awe and terror, not because humans were stronger or smarter or more numerous, but because humans had given them something infinitely more precious than technology or territory or power. Humans had given them back their mortality, and in doing so, humans had given them back their lives in the end. The immortals learned the most terrifying truth of all. They had not conquered death. Death had conquered them, slowly and quietly, stealing everything that made existence worthwhile while leaving them trapped in bodies that could not end. And it took a species of brief, burning mortals to show them that living forever was never the same as truly living. The galaxy would never forget that lesson. And as long as beings existed who remembered what humans had done, the fire that burned in mortal hearts would continue to light the darkness between the stars. That was humanity's legacy. Not empires or monuments or conquests, but the simple, profound, terrifying truth that death is what makes life worth living, and that the universe belongs not to those who last the longest, but to those who burn the brightest.